Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be a very brief review on an MAS Katana, the Kuroyuri, for crying out loud, I really don't remember what it is or how to say it, but there will be information in the description below on what it is, where to find it, and where you can buy it if you're interested. Things to know about MAS. MAS is probably, well, it's martial arts swords, and they're probably best known for making L6 katanas or gumdos or various swords. They do a lot of work with L6, which is a type of steel that can be used to make swords, and it's a very resilient, very good steel, supposedly, if it's done properly. Before we go too far into the review, there's a couple bits of information that I think are important for you to hear up front before I go and ramble on, as I often do, about swords. So the first important bit is that these are my own thoughts and opinions, and they are based on the limited time that I spent with the sword, my own internal comparisons, the comparisons I make to other bits in my collection, but know that I did not personally cut with the sword, and I handled it only a little bit. So a big part of my impressions and what you're going to hear in this review is related to some of the feedback that other people in my Toyama Ryu group have given me about this particular sword. So I didn't cut with it, other people that swing the sword better than me did, and I used their opinions in this video, and I will say that they influenced mine quite heavily. Now also know that this is not my sword, it's on loan from a friend of mine, and that friend is not having the greatest time in buying a sword from MAS. That does provide me some sort of bias because he's my friend, I value his opinion and friendship, and when I see that he's not having a great time, of course that influences me and my opinion as well. He bought a sword from MAS, it didn't arrive in a condition he was happy with, he was able to trade it in toward a different sword, which is the one that we're reviewing right now. He wasn't particularly pleased with that and is having a little bit of a struggle trying to get either his money back from MAS or a sword in the quality that he's looking for. So know that those things are going on during the time of this review, and if you think that they would influence my opinion, again, I will try to be objective as I always am, but if you think that that might influence my opinion, then you know before you hear anything else I have to say. Alright, on with the fun stuff. A brief explanation of some of the measurements that I'm going to outline. The Nagase is basically the blade. It's measured from the tip to the munmachi, or where the Hibachi effectively begins. The Suka is measured from basically either end of the handle grip, but it doesn't include the cross guard or the Tsuba. Sori is the measurement of the curvature of the blade. So if you set the blade where the tip and the munmachi area were on a table and measured the highest point, that would effectively be the measurement of the Sori, or curvature. The motohaba and sakihaba are effectively just the width of the blade at 2 points. So one is measured from the munmachi, hamachi, or think of it as like the top of where the hibachi is. The other is measured where the yakote is, or kind of where the tip of the sword begins. I'm not entirely sure if the sakihaba is supposed to be measured there, but that's where I'm measuring it from, for a point of reference for the measurements you're going to see in just a moment. Moto kasane and saki kasane are effectively the thickness of the blade at the same points mentioned for the motohaba and sakihaba. So basically it's just a width and thickness measurement between the two. As promised, here are the measurements, and what you can see is the blade that I have in my hand as well as the advertised specifications. Now, not all these specifications or measurements are advertised, but I did my best to compile a list of what I could find. So my blade has a little bit longer ska or handle, a little bit longer blade. The Sori and the other thickness measurements weren't really mentioned online, but there is one part that says the blade can be 0.21 inches thick. Mine is a little bit thicker than that, though it doesn't measure it further up the blade, so I can't tell you if there's a distal taper. The weight is something a little bit interesting in the sense that this is 2 pounds 5 ounces, which makes it neither a light blade nor a heavy blade, but it has a higher than average point of balance. That's the point at which you can hold the blade outside of the scabbard on your finger and have it balance. It's 5.75 inches from the Tsuba or handguard up onto the blade. And that's a little bit more forward than what you would expect for a blade of this particular size, which gives it kind of a tip-heavy feeling, if you will. The other thing to note is that their website says that some of the blades are less than 2 pounds 2 ounces, but then goes on to say that this blade is 2 pounds 4 ounces. So it's a little tough for me to sort out what they mean by that. Maybe they just meant the bare blade, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Alright, so if I look at the saya from the get-go, what I can tell you is that it's got a really nice gloss finish on it. Actually, you know, I don't know that it's really nice. It's a sufficient gloss, at least it seems sufficient in terms of what it is. It doesn't seem overly thick is kind of what I'm driving at. The shape of the saya is pretty good. It starts out a little thicker, has a nice little distal taper, a generally pleasing shape in your hand. but I'm noticing as I look over the saya that there are a good amount of imperfections in it. Just a little bit here and a little bit there, like a hair got caught in it, a minor blemish, and that's, I don't understand that this sword has been in an obi a few times, so I'm kind of looking away from the superficial scratches and the things that just kind of look like imperfections in the actual doing of the lacquer. What I also notice is that the lacquer overlaps the Koiguchi and Koijiri and Kurikata. I can see some buffing marks on them, but overall the horn portion is actually coated in such a way that you can't make out that it's horn. It's been lacquered over, which isn't bad, but a lot of times you can make out the definition line of where the horn begins. I can tell that they're horn, but they are lacquered over on the sides. The saya holds the sword correctly. It doesn't fall out, which is the way it should be. I did notice that when I was doing a little bit of noto that the saya had a tendency to grab the blade a little bit before the hibaki. It might be a little tense in there, but the blade and saya fit together pretty well, and it holds on properly without being really too tight to draw or very cumbersome to deal with. So the saya overall isn't bad. There are some imperfections, but you know, that's not necessarily uncommon. If I move on to the Tsuba area, I like the transition between the Fuchi and the Koiguchi and the Tsuba. Everything seems to line up in a way that's very aesthetically pleasing, no giant jarring transitions, and that's something that I'll say probably flows through the entire blade. There's really no enormous, terrible transitions in it. The Tsuba is tight, and if I look at the Fuchi and Kashira, the other fittings, they look like they're cast, you know, like recast bits of things that were carved at some point, maybe lost wax. I'm not exactly sure how there's minor imperfections in the casting though, but they are a little different than the average crappy casting. They're just, the casting quality is not amazing, but it's sufficient and they have a nice look to them. The Minuki have some detail in some spots and look kind of plain and flat in others. Though admittedly, whether or not you like the aesthetics of it is very subjective. I'd say that they are all functional for their intended purpose, and the transitions of the Ito and everything line up in a way that's pleasing and what I would call at least thought out and proper. The Ito itself, though, is really loose in some spots. You can move it around. It seems to be much looser towards the Fuchi area versus the Kashira. It gets a little tighter towards the end, but it's still pretty loose for a brand new, hardly handled sword. Also, there are some imperfections in the Samegawa. You can make out the panels if you move the Ito around a little bit, so it does have a paneled construction, and there is like a big ding in one of the areas near the Mikugi, like it may have been damaged and then kind of died and left in there. So, you know, an undamaged panel would have been more ideal. Anyway, the shape of the Suka, though, is very, very nice. It has a good look to it, a good shape. It feels nice in the hand. The Kashira doesn't move around. The knot at the end seems tight, but the Ito gives me a little bit of pause. I would think that this is going to need, well, that it's frankly going to come loose sooner than later, and this will likely require a rewrap in the not terribly distant future. If I move on to the Hibaki is just a simple brass shape, but it's a little bit different. You know, it's got some nice appeal to it, but it wiggles and rattles a little bit, which is also not great for a brand new sword. Let me see if I can get this closer to the microphone. Not terribly appealing. The rest of the side, the Tsuba, the Suka doesn't rattle, but the Hibaki has a little bit of rattle to it. You can also make out a kind of gap in the hamachi area where it meets the Hibaki. The blade itself, in terms of the aesthetics of the blade, it has what I would really consider more of a martial arts practitioner's grade polish, in that it doesn't have a whole lot of aesthetic details that are brought out in the L6, but you can certainly make out the hamon. The Kasaki is good enough, I would say. The burnishing is consistent, but it's certainly not great, and you can make out kind of the sand lines that they used. I'm being a little hard on it, but this is an $1,800 sword, so if you're, you know, it says hand stone finish, and I would say the burnishing can be better, and that the polish is pretty basic, but it does the job. You can see the hamon, and you can, you know, it's a mirror polish along the spine of the blade or the back of the blade, but there's a little bit more detail in terms of the darkening or burnishing on the blade itself, and it has a nice look, but it's just very basic. Then again, L6 doesn't have a lot of character to it, at least in terms of stuff to bring out. There's no folded hata to bring out. There's, you know, there are some things that can be brought out in the L6, but I'm not seeing any of them here, and that's not necessarily crazy. I mean, if it's a Howard Clark L6 blade with a really fancy polish, then that's great, but oftentimes it costs me more to get a katana polished from Howard Clark than this whole new katana does here. So that's not unexpected. Just pointing out that, you know, if it's supposed to be an art polish, it's a little lacking, at least in comparison to really higher end L6 blades. But I would say it does the job. The thing I'm going to note about the blade, though, in terms of the geometry, is it has a secondary bevel that's a little easier to notice. And this is the thing I, again, did not cover that other people have. What I can tell you about how it feels, though, is it feels great in the hand. It moves easy enough. The Ito isn't a big concern as I'm moving it, but I can kind of feel it being loose if I pay attention to it. It's easy to draw, it's easy to resheath, it's a very comfortable sword. It's easy to generate tip speed, but I did find it a little harder to stop, which is kind of a weird sensation. This sword does 2 pounds 5 ounces and really has a very stout look to it. It's got a wide profile, but it's a little thinner than the average sword, and it just feels really good in the hand. It feels lighter than 2 pounds 5 ounces. It's on the very average side of weight, and that 2 pounds 5 ounces is not really light, but it's not really heavy either. Katana can be as light as, say, 1.5 pounds, and they can be, you know, maybe real close to 5 pounds if you're still talking about katana. But obviously that encompasses a lot of weights and sizes and thicknesses. This is on the stouter, bigger side of blades, but it is more on the average side of weight, at least if you look at it versus its weight. And I would just say it doesn't feel like a 2 pound 5 ounce sword. It feels lighter than that. It feels more balanced in your hand. It's easy to generate tip speed, but I did find it a little harder to stop. That isn't terribly surprising. It's not an unheavy sword, so if you're moving it fast, it's going to be a little harder to stop. And I didn't have a lot of chance to swing this around and get used to it either. I only got a little bit of time to handle it, and from my overall impressions are that it seems comfortable in the hand. I actually like the way it feels, but I tend to prefer a little bit of tip heaviness. This has a very pleasant feeling to me. The downsides, though, are that the blade does not cut well, and the feedback that I got from the person that owns the sword, as well as others at the dojo that cut with the sword, is that the performance was really subpar, and that you could aspire to get better performance from much less expensive swords. So the option on the table, if you do, is, well, for a new $1,800 sword, are you going to have to resharpen it? Are you going to have to reprofile the edge? Are you going to try and return it after using it? Is that an option? And it's a frustrating thing, but it's not terribly surprising looking at the edge with a secondary bevel. I do a lot of smashing things with swords, and when it has a secondary bevel, it can make it a little bit more cumbersome to cut through things. That's, you know, to each their own. I would say, though, that if you have a katana that's intended for performance cutting, that having a secondary bevel on it seems a little odd straight from the manufacturer. Katanas are kind of known for not having that secondary bevel. Not to say they didn't happen historically, but generally speaking, you don't have a secondary bevel, and the fact that this does is a bit disappointing, and I think is what's throwing off the game a little bit. All right, let me wrap this thing up. Do I think it's worth the $1,830 asked? In short answer, no. There's a couple things that are really concerning to me, and let me set the stage for why I'm saying that. One, this blade is really geared toward a practitioner. L6 lacks some of the refinements and beauty that you might see from laminated or folded steels, or things with more effort put into the actual polish of the blade, and some of the artistic in this beauty in the steel brought out. That's not really what you see here. What you have here is a tool that's really geared towards practitioners who cut a lot and who want a tool that is durable and consistent and good to use for that end. And if I think with that mindset, then one, the loose Ito straight out of the box is really not cool. Loose Ito can cost you $50 to fix if you know a guy, or it could cost you a couple $100s or more to get fixed if you have to send it off to a professional to have done. And having to have that done is really disappointing for a brand new sword. You'd expect it to be tight and last for a while. It's going to come loose after many years or a lot of use, but it's certainly not supposed to be after a couple weeks and 10 tatami mats, or maybe even a couple days and 10 tatami mats. The other thing, the loose Hibachi is a little bit concerning. Hibachis will develop a rattle over time. That's just what Hibachis will do in a sword that you use. So the fact that it rattles isn't something that I don't expect, but it's not something I expect right now, right? I expect that the heat shields on my Subaru car are going to rattle originally, because that's what they do, and I live in a state that pours salt all over the roads in the wintertime. It's going to happen. I just don't expect it to happen when I drive the car off the lot. Maybe that's not the most applicable analogy, but what I will say is that the loose Hibachi after only a couple tatami mat cutting sessions is really also disappointing. The blade itself, though, the secondary bevel, and what I've heard from folks that I respect and whose abilities I look up to in terms of cutting, the fact that they're saying it's not the greatest in terms of cutting, and that it's really not up to snuff in terms of sharpness, is also a pretty big disappointment. I'm certainly bowing to their superior knowledge in that area, as they are the teachers for me to look less like a jerk when I'm cutting. I respect their opinion on, is the blade sharp enough to cut tatami? Well, yes, you can cut tatami with it. Is it as sharp as you would like for a competition grade, kind of the highest end custom, well, maybe not custom, but the highest end kind of competition grade sword? I don't really think it's quite up to snuff. You can do some basic paper cutting tests with it, but it is not as desirable as it could be, and I think a lot of that has to do with that it has a secondary bevel on it. I know that traditionally you might see some katanas with secondary bevels on them, but a lot of that I think is almost like a soldier sharpening his sword in the battlefield kind of thing, or on a campaign or something like that. But very often the more traditional geometry or more expected geometry for a Japanese sword doesn't really have a big old secondary bevel in it, and I think that might be what's affecting the cutting performance. But then again, I haven't cut with it. That's just some of the feedback that I'm kind of building into my opinion, as it's geared toward practitioners, and the practitioners I know aren't terribly happy with it. I'm gonna say that that's the downside. The thing I do like about it, though, it feels really good in my hand. I think it has a very cool look. It has an L6 construction, which is not something you see on a lot of swords, and MAS seems to, at least it's cut some tatami mats and hasn't dented, and that's more than I can say for the Hanwei Oni katana that I tested some time ago. I did a video where I bumped that into a stand, and one bad cut led to a pretty bad ding in the edge. I don't see any blade deformation in this sword. It looks just fine. The edge looks good, but it looks like a secondary bevel, which is inherently maybe not the best for tatami mat cutting. But you tell me if you have any comments about that, or the secondary bevel, or how it cuts tatami mats, or any of that kind of stuff. Throw it down in the commentary below. I think maybe what would be best would be to compare this MAS katana to this Citadel katana. Now there's other swords that you can get for $2,000, but these are both about $2,000, thereabouts. What you're going to see in terms of difference is really that the Citadel seems to hit more the mark of the assembly, and the MAS is made from L6 and has a little bit more decoration. Now, these are at least closer than, say, some of the other $2,000 swords that have folded blades and sanmai constructions. Both of them are made from like a modern mono performance-based steel. The Citadel piece has just a better fit and finish in terms of the Hibachi being fit properly, in terms of the Ito being tight consistently, in terms of the blade geometry not having a secondary bevel and being a desirably better sharpness straight out of the box. The Citadel seems to hit the nail on the head a little bit more. This is supposed to be made out of L6, though. The MAS is made out of L6, which is supposedly a more durable steel in terms of shock and bend resistance and that type of thing. Unfortunately, I haven't really tested the Citadel's 1075 versus the MAS L6, and frankly, I'm not going to. But in any respect, I find that if you have a sword that is properly made, they generally tend to be reasonably durable straight away. I'm not overly impressed with the secondary bevel on this one, and this one has a more pristine cutting edge. This one, I will admit, the MAS feels a little bit better in my hand to my personal preferences, though. The Citadel feels a little bit lighter and different feeling, but They're very, very similar blades, and I would just say that if you add $2,000, the Citadel blade seems to hit more of the fit and finish than the MAS blade does. I mean, that's just me personally, but that would be my 2 cents on it if you had $2,000 to spend. Though I admittedly do like the black on black with some blacky black, and I do like how it feels in my hand. It feels pretty good. But I'd still go with the Citadel. But I still think it has some stuff to offer potential buyers and practitioners. I don't think it's a terrible ripoff, and maybe I came off a little harsher than I meant to. It's still a good sword, but there are just a lot of other really good products out there, and it's not that this isn't adequate. It's just that there are others that really excel. So I hope it was helpful, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to do more with this sword and show you more details, but I hope the limited time I had with it was at least useful to you. Cheers! And thanks for watching. This is the Kuroyuri, what the hell is it called? It's called the Kuroyuri. People cutting with it. And yeah, I'm not going to be Korean gumdo, maybe I'm saying that wrong. Amazing and cool and super steely as really quick. It's like driving your car off the lot for 10 minutes and then having to have like the midlife oil crisis change. That's not really applicable at all. I'm just saying this, I can hold them up. As always, thank you for watching, and cheers, or cheers, and thank you for watching. I'm gonna figure out how to do these videos one day.